introduce yourself. State your name, you know how to do it.
My name is Dan Greenberg. I'm president of the Advanced Arkansas Institute. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to speak briefly. I think that the things I say may provoke a few questions, and if it's all right with you, maybe we could have these gentlemen stick around a little more because they might be better at answering these questions than I would. I'd just like to speak to you briefly as state legislators. I'd like to say a few words about what I take to be the original vision of the founders when it comes to state legislators. I think state legislators were originally supposed to be something like a board of directors for Congress. State legislators were originally supposed to provide guidance and maybe even ride herd a little bit on Congress so as to ensure that Congress's powers and Congress's actions would remain limited and respect the principles of limited government. Today, I think the balance of powers is a little bit out of whack, and so I suggest to all of you that you have powers as state legislators to right the imbalance and restore federalism, and that's what I'd like to talk about. Because state legislators really do have a vital role under the Constitution to indirectly control the size and scope of the federal government. For much of American history, state legislators had a direct role in that state legislators would directly elect senators. Of course, that method of indirectly controlling senators is gone, but I think that it behooves all of us to think about how we can use the power of state legislators to put a check on the size and scope of government. And I urge all members of the General Assembly to consider all of its alternatives when looking at constitutional reform to that end. I'd like to briefly describe some of the substantive constitutional amendments that are available to this body, and also briefly discuss the measures available to you that any changes to the Constitution would be as safe and as risk-free as possible. I think it's easy to get kind of misdirected and have the discussion get kind of abstract, and so I'd just like to say a few words about 2 or 3 possible amendments to the Constitution I think this body would profit from considering. The first is called the Regulation Freedom Act. Senator Dismay introduced a measure at the state level that is aimed at changing or shrinking the influence of out-of-control regulators. And I think by and large, that is good policy. That will be up before the voters later on this year. I think at the federal level, there's something called the Regulation Freedom Amendment, which would accomplish much the same thing. Congress doesn't approve new federal regulations, even though these regulations are in effect the laws that govern us, and there's little or no accountability placed on the shoulders of the bureaucrats who write these laws. If we don't like the actions of a member of Congress, we can vote him or her out of office, but an unelected bureaucrat doesn't face that kind of constraint. And so what's been called the Regulation Freedom Amendment would address this problem because it would give Congress something like a veto power over counterproductive regulations. And so this is an amendment that would restore self-government to our constitutional scheme, would restore lawmaking power to democratically accountable public officials. Members of Congress would be ultimately responsible for the regulations that affect people's lives. And those federal legislators would have to answer the voters to the rules that impose the burden on us. The method of this would be very simple. The idea would be that when there was a regulation that a number of members of Congress found particularly offensive, they could simply put their objection on record. And when a quarter of the body identified the same offensive regulation, then Congress would have to vote to approve it, to keep it in effect. Again, this is the kind of thing that would restore self-government, restore democratically accountable government, and I think it would eliminate, or at least shrink, the kind of government by unaccountable regulators that I've heard so many people in the state legislature complain about. You could also consider what's been called the Madison Amendment, and the Madison Amendment, very briefly, would shrink the scope of any amendments to convention just to one amendment. And of course, the way that would work and the beneficial consequence that would have would be that there would be no fear of a runaway convention, which I know that we've discussed before, because there would be only one item on the agenda. And again, the Madison Amendment is a way to cabin or confine the scope of any Amendment 5, scope of any Article 5 convention. So there are just lots of things that this body can consider to control the size and scope of the federal government. We've heard discussions of amendment to balance the federal budget, or to limit congressional terms, or to eliminate unfunded federal mandates. I'd also like to, before I close, I'd also like to say one thing about the procedure of an Amendment 5 convention, Article 5 convention, excuse me. And that has to do with these fears of a runaway convention that we hear so much discussion of. I think that when we talk about the dangers of a runaway convention, it's a little bit overstated, and I'd like to explain why. Imagine if one of your constituents came to you and said, look, I've been hearing bad things about the, for instance, I've been hearing bad things about the Transportation Committee over in the Capitol. The House Transportation Committee, it's a runaway committee. They're considering a whole bunch of stuff. I'm very concerned about it. I take it that if one of your constituents came up to you and talked about the Runaway Transportation Committee, you'd explain to them, look, here's how it works in the legislature. It's not that they can do anything on their own. Whatever the Transportation Committee does, first it has to go to the full House, and then it has to go through a Senate committee, then it has to be voted on in the Senate, and then it has to be not vetoed by the governor. So there's a long process that it has to go through, and so there's really no need to worry about one committee being run away in any sense. In much the same way, the danger of a runaway constitutional convention is quite overstated, because, as we've already said, it's not that the convention can create anything. It's not that the convention can change anything in life on its own, because whatever the convention does has to be ratified by 38 states. And so the idea that somehow a constitutional convention is going to confuse, hundreds of thousands or millions of people in 38 states and somehow get something written in the Constitution, just kind of sneak it by the people, I think is really vastly overstated. I will close by saying that if you're concerned about this problem of a runaway convention, I think that there is something in state law that you could do, and this was discussed briefly about a year ago in the full session. You could pass an anti-runaway convention law, which would basically say any delegate who ignores state instructions to limit the convention to an up or down vote on just one amendment would be immediately replaced, and his votes would be nullified. I don't know that this is a perfect solution, and I think it's a matter of some controversy as to how much this would affect, but it is certainly an additional safeguard against a runaway convention. It's something like buying fire insurance if you're worried that there's going to be a fire. But I think the state legislature could easily pass a law that says delegates have to take a pledge to limit their actions to those that are required by state law. The law could provide for the automatic resignation of delegates who violate that pledge. If you have a majority of states with this law, I think it becomes difficult or impossible to envision any kind of Article 5 convention to approve any unauthorized amendment. Indiana passed a bill to this effect last year. This legislature, the General Assembly, considered this measure last year, and I think it's probably a worthwhile thing to explore. Now, having said that, I'd be happy to take any questions, but I just do want to urge all state legislators in this room to exercise their power to limit the size and scope of the federal government, because it really is available to you under the Constitution in a way that's not available to most citizens. Thanks. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you.